Okay, it looks like people are going to just join one at a time now, so I'll let people enter as they join us. But good morning, everyone, and welcome to our May edition of our Science Communication webinar. As most of y'all know, I'm Sarah Schweitzer, and I'm the Assistant Chief of the Division of Wildlife Management over Wildlife Diversity Program. And I'm going to be your host today. And a couple of reminders before we get going to please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted. And as you have questions, please put them in the chat. And then near the end of the presentation, we'll be able to get to your questions. So today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Murray West. She received her Bachelor's of Science degree from Appalachian State University with a concentration in ecology and evolutionary studies. In 2023, she completed her PhD at UNCW in the Department of Biology and Marine Biology. And she was under the advisement of Dr. Ray Danner. She received fellowships and awards during her PhD program, which allowed her to further develop her research on Saltmarsh sparrows, which was primarily funded by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and John Carpenter was the PI for that project. She used radio telemetry to characterize movements throughout the day and tidal cycle, estimated home range size, and estimated abundance and density of saltmarsh sparrows, as well as Nelson's and seaside sparrows. Ray's work focused on the wintering ecology of the saltmarsh sparrow, filling a big knowledge gap for this declining population, and on impacts that sea level rise is having on their winter habitats. Her work will help us in North Carolina and throughout the southern portion of the Atlantic Flyway and Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, and help us better manage habitat for wintering coastal sparrows and other species dependent on this habitat. Currently, Maria is the Executive Vice President of the Sandbar Oyster Company that develops living shorelines, conducts habitat restoration, and grows oysters. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure to have Dr. West present her research.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all for having me. So I look forward to discussing part of my dissertation research with you guys today regarding the winter population biologies and impacts of sea level rise on saltmarsh sparrows in North Carolina. Like Sarah said, my research also focused on seaside and Nelson sparrows, so you will see a little bit of data regarding those throughout the presentation as well, because they're somewhat interconnected. So I began my studies in 2018 at UNCW. The first few years of my research was funded with a cooperative agreement by the Wildlife Resources Commission, so the work is done because of you all, so thank you all. Like she said, John Carpenter was our main PI for this project. I then received a North Carolina Sea Grant Sentinel Site Cooperative Grant, which funded the initial part of my sea level rise research. I was then awarded the Margaret A. Davidson Fellowship through NOAA and the NEAR system, which funded 2 more years of this research and allowed me to increase the study spatially. The Wildlife Resources Commission also allowed me to use 2 technicians for 3 years of this research, which was essential for getting this done, because it takes a lot of manpower, woman power in this case, to get all these birds captured and tagged. So thank you all for that. So in ornithology, there is a research bias towards breeding birds and breeding biology, but it's really important to understand a bird's full annual cycle. So for many vertebrates, including birds, their non-breeding and breeding periods are inextricably linked. And what occurs in one period can carry over to the next period of life. As we know, salt marshes provide essential habitat for many terrestrial and aquatic species and provide a variety of other ecosystem services, including but not limited to being terrestrial carbon sinks, having cultural and economic value, and providing coastal protection. Oh, sorry, there should. So in the United States, there's about 3.8 million acres of salt marsh, 75% of which are located in the southeastern United States. So here's just a nice drone video over Mason Borough Island showing that extensive marsh habitat. And our marsh species are losing essential habitat due to factors such as sea level rise, development, and other anthropogenic forces. Here you can see this marsh leading up to a bulkhead is just eroding and eroding away. In some places in the southeast US, 3 species of New World sparrows occur syntopically, so the same place at the same time. So we have Nelson sparrows, saltmarsh sparrows, and seaside sparrows. Sorry if I'm talking fast. I just have a lot to get through today to show you all as much as I can from this research. Like I said, I'll mainly be focusing on saltmarsh sparrows today. The saltmarsh sparrow is endemic to salt marshes of the east coast of North America. It's a species of conservation concern and requires conservation efforts immediately. Saltmarsh sparrow breeding populations have been declining about 9% a year from 1998 to 2012, and they're expected to go extinct between 2035 and 2060. Just to briefly touch on the other two species we'll be talking about, just so you have a little background on them. Nelson sparrows occur in central to eastern North America. They have a broader breeding habitat than saltmarsh sparrows. But prior to 1995, saltmarsh and Nelson sparrows were once lumped into one species called the sharp-tailed sparrow. But then in 1995, they were split based on genetics, vocalization, range, and skeletal morphology. And then the seaside sparrow is endemic to tidal marshes of the Atlantic coast of North America and the Gulf of Mexico, and they are less imperiled. So we had 5 field sites across eastern to southeastern North Carolina. We had the Rachel Carson Reserve, which is our most northern site in Carteret County. We studied that site in 2021 and 2022. We had a Hammock Beach State Park, which we studied in 2021 and 2022 as well. We did not have enough bird radio tracking data for Hammock Beach State Park, just based on the way that the site was shaped. It was really hard to get our telemetry system out far enough to feel like we could accurately represent the space used by the sparrows. And so this was a field site, but I'm not going to present data on that today. We did do marker capture there, but that's about it for one season of telemetry. Masonboro Island was our most frequented site because we went there in 2019, 2020, 21, and 2022. We went to Bald Head Island / Zeke's Island at 2020, 2021, and 22, and then Bird Island for 2021 and 2022. We selected these sites to measure geographic variation in the region, and we do think that we got a pretty good understanding of these birds' habitats and movements in North Carolina based on these 5 sites. So let's start by first looking at winter space use. So as you can see in this video, we're flushing birds. This is on Masonboro Island at high tide. They are known to congregate in really large abundances in some supertidal habitats, but it's unclear where they go at low tide, of which we know there are 2 highs and 2 low tides a day. The periodic inundation makes the extent of their available habitat dynamic, and it's really thought to influence their daily movements. So we have limited research on these daily movements in the home range, but understanding them is essential for protecting their habitat. So what is limiting them? High tide, low tide? We need to figure that out. And then the extensive marsh habitat do seem to be sensitive to small differences in elevation. So what were our methods? First, we did mark recapture. So we did mark and recapture for all years from 2019 to 2022. We banded every individual that we caught and then took a variety of morphometric measurements. The first 2 years, we did something called null peak radiotelemetry, where we tagged birds using a glue-on technique. But this really limited us into where we could safely get out when we could safely get out in the field, because we had to set these up every time. The tags had limited battery life, and the glue-on methods just didn't really allow the tags to stay on the birds for very long. It was good for learning this, like the general area where these birds were hanging out. We then, for years 3 and 4, used cellular tracking technologies. So some of you all might be familiar with that or are potentially interested in using it to study a species you're interested in for the Wildlife Resources Commission. So I have some information here, but if you would like to talk about that further, I am happy to do so. This allowed for continual data collection during daylight hours due to the fact that we were using tags that were only read during daylight because they were solar paneled. This allowed us to get really high quality and quantity data. We were collecting data autonomously, leading to less research or disturbance, and data collecting during all conditions, which we were not able to do with our null peak radiotelemetry system, because we were limited to good tides and good weather. And so the cellular tracking technologies, we put the system out in the marsh, tag the birds, and then they just track them for as long as that bird held that tag. And we put those on using leg loop harness. So just briefly, how does CTT work? If Emily Naste's from NC State ever did a presentation for you guys, you might have seen this slide. This is from her because she also used CTT. And so here we have an array of receiver nodes, which capture the signal put out by that bird's tag. We have a centrally located sensor station. This, for our case, included an omnidirectional antenna to capture data from those nodes. A sensor station, which is what collects the data and sends it remotely using cellular. This is our solar panel. We had a marine battery, and then we would tag the birds. The bird would then fly around their habitat where the nodes were located. So say this bird flew here, it was then detected by these two nodes, and then they have a signal strength for where that tag was, and so you could triangulate their general area. This then sends data every 6 hours to that sensor station, and then that data gets uploaded wirelessly. So this is a really nice way to autonomously get a ton of information that we could use every day and make daily reports to see our bird location. Here are our 4 sites and the CTT arrays that we put out. The reds are the nodes that we placed in the first years that we telemetered, and the greens represent where we added nodes in the second year. We had funding to get more nodes, hence the additional ones, and we also looked at our telemetry within the first year and decided that these were the locations where we thought would be beneficial to really understand if they were going out to those extra spaces used. So after we did all of our data collection, we were left with millions of data points, but not all of them are good, so we had to do some CTT data prep. So we first had to determine the location of our tagged individuals during a given period of time through trilateration of received signal strength, or RSSI. We then were able to infer our tag location from coincident detections by different nodes using the signal attenuation and models relating distance to RSSI. We then accounted for signal attenuation caused by the physical landscape, which there is going to be at any point because we're working in habitats with grass and everything. And so we did a study of, we went out in the field and did some habitat testing, and we were able to employ these filters. We then built our final data set with a minimum RSSI of -95 decibels and applied our signal attenuation model. And then we removed data points that occurred within a 4-hour window when we were present on site, because we know that we are definitely influencing these birds' behavior and locations when we're out there capturing them. We then merged our final location data with verified tide heights at each station near each reserve site using our and Tidyverse package, and then derived elevation from the 2020 DEM of the Coastal Carolinas. Now there's a lot there, but my old buddy was integral in getting this portion done. He was an undergrad that helped me with all my whole project. So after all of our CTT data prep, here are our final numbers of birds that we use for our final analysis. If the numbers in parentheses, it indicates the birds that we use for the home range analysis, but some were removed for because we had limited relocations. So here, if we want to look at Saltmarsh sparrows, we had 9 at Bald Head, 3 at Bird Island. We used 3 at Masonboro Island and 10 at Rachel Carson. The number of sparrows really Saltmarsh sparrows specifically really ranged between where we were tagging. So to assess space use, we first looked at daily movements to the distance to the netting location and also elevation. Let me get the laser pointer here. So we looked at daily movements from distance to netting location, which was the supertidal habitat location, and then elevation in relation to tide. And then we used Bayesian generalized linear multi-level models to assess this. The models include either distance to the net or elevation as the response variable, and tide height and species as our interactive or additive population level or fixed effects. Because our data set contains several observations from each individual, we included a group level or random effect for that individual bird. The high temporal resolution of the data led to temporal autocorrelation. So we modeled autocorrelated within each day for each bird by setting the autoregressive order to 1. We decided to use the Bayesian framework instead of a frequentist model because it allowed for complex models that accounted for autocorrelation and repeated measures and allowed us to compare model parameters among species from different models. So with our Bayesian outputs, we were comparing credible intervals to determine the parameters, if the parameters were significantly different here. So let's start by looking at our distance to netting location. So for our model parameters, here we show that, so our Saltmarsh sparrows, this is grouped by site. So Baldhead, Bird Island, Mason Sparrow, Rachel Carson. Saltmarsh sparrow was the one species we had at every single field site we went to. And so here we can see our Saltmarsh is kind of listed here. It's if it's not listed, that means it was the intercept value that we were using to compare. So our models show that birds move significantly further from the netting location at low tide. You can tell this because the 95% credible interval does not include the 0. So if it's significant, it does not cross this 0. For here, we can see our line here, our slope. So showing again that at higher tide heights, they are closer to the netting location, and then they go further away from the netting location. These are our model predictions based on our model results from the last slide. We can see the predictions of how a bird would move in relation to the tide. So the orange line is going to be our Saltmarsh sparrow that we're focusing on today. So we can see that seaside move further from the netting location than the Saltmarsh in general at low tides. The dots are the raw data points, and the prediction interval is in gray, reflecting there's a lot of variation in this data. And so again, at a lot of these sites, our seaside sparrows are moving further than our Saltmarsh sparrows, except here at Bird Island. At Rachel Carson, we only tagged Saltmarsh sparrows, and they moved approximately 150 meters away from the netting location at low tide. At Mason Sparrow Island, our Saltmarsh sparrows moved about 145 meters from the netting location. At Baldhead, they moved about 192 meters. And at Bird Island, they moved 235 meters. So their distance from netting location ranged between 140 and 240 meters from the netting location. So they weren't moving super far. So again, all species show the same pattern, moving with the tidal cycle, but there were site by species difference here. So now looking at daily movements using elevation, our model parameters show that birds use a variety of elevations through the day, as we'd assume, because they're moving with that tide. So they're moving out to lower elevations at low tide and coming up to higher elevations at high tide. At Baldhead and Mason Sparrow, we saw that 3 species, at Baldhead, here we had all 3 species, and seaside sparrows use significantly larger elevation gradient than Nelson's and Saltmarsh for some reason, but that was not significantly different at Mason Sparrow Island. Onto our model predictions, again showing that seaside sparrows use a larger elevation gradient, and so they're using more habitat. So this shows that our Saltmarsh sparrows are staying really close and not using a large range of elevation throughout their winter stationary period. So they're using the same pattern, using the range of elevations, but there was site by species difference, with the Saltmarsh sparrows using a pretty limited elevation range. We also looked at home range. So we first calculated minimum convex polygons. We calculated this at the 95th percentile. We then looked at time local convex hull. We did MCPs because they don't account for patterns in space use over time or clustering at point, but they're really useful in studying the broad space used by these species. We then wanted to look at a more in-depth one, so we used the time local convex hull polygon. These are non-parametric statistics that create utilization distributions with the addition of a timestamp. So this explicit incorporation of time into the data set is important when we have really high temporal resolution. The T-loco-H creates a whole-based data set based on the nearest neighbors, which reduces the likelihood of overestimating our home ranges, which can happen at times. This is important in our system because they have pretty distinct habitats that they use and habitat boundaries such as creeks and stuff. So we calculated this at the 95th and 50th percentile. But again, having a really broad range and then a narrow can really help us answer a lot of questions. We could then use Bayesian linear models as previously described. So here we have just a box and whisker plot showing the difference in site species at each site with our home range size. These are in hectares on the y-axis and species shown in different colors. So our Saltmarsh sparrow is in orange here, again, represented for every site that we looked at. We did find a variation in site and species, but here for our MCPs at 95th percentile, they used about 0.9 hectares or 2.6 hectares at Bald Head, 5 hectares at Bird Island, 4 at Masonboro, and 2 at Rachel Carson. So again, these vary by site and species, but Saltmarsh sparrow used the most space at Bird Island with the least amount of space at Rachel Carson, which Rachel Carson would make sense. It was by far our smallest site at only about 11 acres total. So here we have our results from our T-Loco-H. This in general shows that Saltmarsh sparrows have smaller home ranges, but it was not significantly different from Seaside or Nelson's. But all species did maintain home ranges through the winter stationary period. This is the question we didn't know the answer to. Like, are they actually maintaining home ranges through the winter stationary period? And we were able to answer yes, that they are. They're staying in pretty limited home ranges. So here is our isopleth map from the T-Loco-H analysis for Saltmarsh sparrows at our 4 different sites. Here we have our Bald Head site for our Saltmarsh sparrows. So we can see here that our 95th percentile, they used about 0.65 at the 95th. So the broadest range of the habitat we were, home range we were looking at was at 95. The mid range was the 50, which is the darker purple. And so here, I know these are a little bit hard to see, but the light purple shows the range, and we can see how kind of scattered this is. It isn't broad like an MCP covering a whole area. We were thinking about doing KDEs, but that creates those distribution holes, and it seemed to incorporate a lot of habitat that they wouldn't be using. So we know that these birds aren't spending time in the middle of a creek. And so these maps do a really good job. The isopleth maps from the T-Loco-H do a really nice job just showing the habitat that's definitely being used with it by excluding all these areas of creeks that would be potentially in other home range models unless you excluded them. So here we have Bald Head, Bird Island. We can see a little bit more space used around here. Masonboro Island, we had a few distinct ones that were covering a lot of different space use. 2.9 hectares for the 95th and 0.07 for the 50th. So their 50th percentile holes are very, very small, like only 0.1 hectares. And here we have Rachel Carson. They were concentrated up in this northern part of that. So due to ever-shifting availability of foraging habitat, it's likely a reason for the broad use of elevation and movement away from that high tide roosting site. So they're only going to come to the high tide roosting site if they have to. So it seems that that's occurring at really high tides. If it's a really low high tide, they're not going to come up to that roosting site. Our species are not evenly distributed across the marsh landscape, and areas with specific elevation gradient and vegetation structure seem to be really important for these species. So our study does a nice job refining the understanding of these winter space use and helps identify specific areas and configurations of marsh that will be important to conserve. Right now, I'm working with the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture, me and a few other researchers from other states to compile all this winter space use data to help create winter prioritization habitats and map where we think these sparrows might be going in the winter. So this research is already becoming an integral part in making these predictive habitat maps for Saltmarsh sparrows in the wintering range across the whole range. We then looked at winter habitat use. So Saltmarsh sparrows use, in general, drier portions of the marsh dominated by short form Spartina alterniflora during very high tides. But we have no quantitative studies of habitat use and selection in the winter for all 3 of these species. At our field sites, regularly flooded marsh was the most prominent habitat type based on a habitat analysis that we did that I'm not going to go into today. Knowledge of habitats can be really essential in helping identify priority habitats and parcels of the land for conservation for these three species. Again, Saltmarsh sparrows is the one we're most concerned about because they are most imperiled. And so this is pertinent for marsh ecosystems that are in decline. So here we did habitat selection analysis. We used RSF for habitat use and availability for Saltmarsh sparrows on Masonboro Island. So each panel represents an individual bird. Our points were either used, where the locations where we know the bird was, which is in blue, and available, which were randomly selected points within the bird's home range. So here's just a nice map showing, again, that used versus available habitat within the area that we know that they used. We then looked at relative selection strength. So here we mapped RSS values for Masonboro Island for each species as an example here. So Saltmarsh sparrows is here in the center. A lighter blue dot indicates a higher probability that the species would be present at a given time, assuming that all habitats are equally available, which we know they're not, but this is how the model works to start. Predictions are the exponent of the fitted values from the resource selection function, which was shown before. And these were Bayesian logistic linear mixed effect models, and they only show within the area where the species was detected with radiotelemetry at the site. So we're not looking at places where we are unsure. So this is the only places we're definitely detecting them by radiotelemetry. So model prediction showed that relative selection strength of habitat varied among species. So overall, within the species, there was a relatively high RSS for transitional marsh, followed by irregularly flooded marsh, and then regularly flooded marsh. This makes sense because most of our points were going to be congregated at a high tide because that's when the birds are up, that's when they're moving, and that's when they're in that transitional marsh because that's where their high tide habitat is. So this is just showing that more points were being shown or being detected at these higher habitats, so the transitional marsh. If we then account for all the habitat within the area that is being shown, we then did integrated spatial intensities, which shows the variation among species and site. But this is taking into account how much habitat was in each habitat type and the points available. So here we see the opposite effect, with the regularly flooded marsh having the most intensity of use, followed by irregularly flooded marsh and then transitional marsh. So this makes sense because we have a lot of regularly flooded marsh. They're going to be out there more of the time unless it's a really high tide or they need to come up in the high tide habitat. And so again, makes sense that we would have a higher use of these lower marsh habitats for our integrated spatial intensity models. The only place that this was not the case was Masonboro Island, where our Saltmarsh sparrows use more irregularly flooded marsh than regularly flooded marsh. There were only 3 birds in these samples, and they did seem to hang out in really small areas, and a lot of time they were in the juncus or the short form alternative flora, which I think a lot of times gets shown up as slightly more irregularly flooded marsh. So these novel results indicate that marsh sparrow populations and communities require a variety of marsh habitats, and that we need to seek to conserve a range of habitats, both high to low, because they don't really seem to be in a location where it's just high tide or just low tide habitat. So again, management efforts should seek to conserve a range of habitats along this elevation gradient. And then one interesting thing we were noting is a lot of our sites seem to be on the shoulders of remnant inlets. So we think that they really like this habitat because it is that range from the high to low tide habitat and a really nice gradient that they seek, with generally a lot of then low tide habitat expanse available to them. And so maybe potentially looking for shoulders of other remnant inlets or similar habitat configurations to identify priority sites for conservation. Like I said, luckily the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture is already diving in to how to look for these priority locations using data that we have provided to them. So what are the impacts of sea level rise? So for this, we measured abundance and density, and then modeled a sea level rise would affect the extent of the tidal marsh habitat used by saltmarsh sparrows at our 4 sites in 2030, 2040, 2050, and 2100. We used a low, intermediate, and high sea level rise scenarios here. So just to kind of talk about the breeding season real quick. So as we talked about, it's inextricably linked with the non-breeding season. So in the breeding season, researchers are finding that the main drivers of decreased fecundity has been nest flooding and sea level rise. And so here are some sparrows I was able to help go band up in New Jersey, which was super fun. They're so cute. But a lot of these nests are being flooded out. They're also seeing a lot of tidal restrictions up in the northern part of the country. We don't have those as much around here. And then habitat loss and fragmentation was another big driver of their decreased fecundity. The saltmarsh sparrows have evolved in a really interesting way to lay their eggs and have their chicks all within one moon cycle. And so they generally will lay their eggs at a full moon at the peak high tide. And then throughout this moon cycle, they are able to incubate and hatch their eggs. And then the chicks fledge from the nest before the next full moon cycle. This in general has worked really well. It's been a very successful evolutionary strategy to get these birds out of the nest before the flooding happens again. But this flooding is becoming more and more common, and it leads to the chicks drowning if sometimes if the eggs are inundated too long, they will die. They can handle some levels of inundation though. If the chicks are in the stage where they have just hatched, they will drown if they get flooded. At about 5 to 7 days old, these chicks are able to climb up the marsh grass to some extent. So every once in a while, they have some success by being able to climb up the marsh grass away from the high tide. But these are getting more extreme, and hence why the saltmarsh sparrows are having really large decreases of fecundity during their their breeding season. So what are we seeing as for abundance? So as described before, we use marker rate capture and radio telemetry. And so we used open population models to estimate the abundance of birds at each site. Open population models can account for mortality, emigration, recruitment, and immigration throughout the sampling period. So we use Jolly-Sieber models here. We then built capture histories for each individual. The capture history includes a digit for each session. So 1 if the individual is captured and 0 if it was not captured. We then specified the models in R using package marked, and superpopulation models are parameterized to describe a superpopulation, which is the total population assumed to be present over the course of the study. We built several different models that had different specifications and that compared them with the model fit using AIC. After selecting the best model, we then used the model to predict abundances at each site. We then estimated density. So here, pretty simple, we just took our abundance and then divided it by usable habitat. So here we claimed usable habitat was transitional saltmarsh, irregularly flooded marsh, and regularly flooded marsh that fell within the minimum convex polygon for each population at each site. So here we constructed a 100% MCPs based on the location data for all conspecifics pooled per site, which were constructed using data collected with the telemetry data. We then clipped, so something I haven't really talked about is that I did SLAM models, so sea levels affecting marshes models, which was not going to dive totally into today, but the habitat changes you're going to see are from my SLAM models. We then we clipped my SLAM models to the MCP for each site, species, and year, then calculated the percentages of usable habitat that was available in the MCP for each site, species, and year combination. And then we calculated the percent change in usable habitat for each time step modeled. We assumed that density would remain constant at the study site and habitats regardless of patch size because there's currently no data available on this relationship. So we couldn't really model the changes in habitat ability and the density at that site because we don't know. So based on the changes in usable habitat extent from SLAM model, we predicted the birds' abundances in 2050 and 2100. So we conducted 4 to 6 capture sessions per year. I didn't take all the other species out of here because I thought people might want to look at them, but our Saltmarsh sparrow is highlighted in yellow. Our raw capture data revealed differences in abundance among site, capture occasion, and species. Captured the most individuals at Masonboro Island, but not Saltmarsh sparrows. Capture rates varied by session, and our highest abundance of Saltmarsh sparrows were at Bald Head Island. Patterns of density typically reflected the pattern of abundance here. And so here we have the hectares that they used and their abundance from our study period, and then the density included here. So at Bald Head, we had an abundance of 124-ish sparrows with a density of 9.7 birds per hectare. At Bird Island, we had 21 so a density of 1.5 birds per hectare. Masonboro Island, we had 7 individuals, or abundance of 7, with a density of 0.9 birds per hectare. And then at Rachel Carson, we had 19.7 of their abundance, so a density of 4.8 birds per hectare. Saltmarsh sparrows at Bald Head Island were most abundant in our first year, which probably drove this, but the subsequent years we had fewer and fewer Saltmarsh sparrows every season we went out to capture there. Let me get you acquainted with these slides real quickly. So on the left, we have our species, so Saltmarsh sparrows. Here on the top, we have our years modeled. So these are our minimum convex polygons clipped for each site. First, and this is our intermediate sea level rise scenario. So we have 2022, 2030, 2040, 2050, and 2100, with our percent changes down here in hectares of each bird. So again, these are intermediate. At Bald Head here for Saltmarsh sparrows, our percent change in habitat was negative 1.67 by 2030. We lost 6.9% of habitat by 2040, 17% by 2050, and by 2100, 93% of that habitat was lost to only 0.68 hectares of usable habitat left from the initial 12.73. So those are huge declines to have Saltmarsh sparrow habitat at Bald Head. Now looking at Bird Island, again, these are our intermediate scenarios. The high sea level rise scenario looked a lot more stark than this. So for Saltmarsh sparrows at Bird Island by 2050, 11% of the usable habitat was lost. And by 2100, that's 84%. And sorry, I didn't realize that the map was lost, or the key to this was lost. So the darker green is regularly flooded marsh. The light green is irregularly flooded marsh. That deeper sage green is going to be your transitional marsh. Brown is upland, and then this red is your tidal flat. So anything that's red is not usable habitat by 2050. If it's light green or dark green, it's usable habitat. Here at Masonboro Island, again, large changes. So by 2050, 7% is 6.5% declines, but by 2100, about 80% of that is lost. And again, you can see that transition from irregularly flooded marsh to a lot more regularly flooded marsh to tidal flat. But again, remembering they like this range of elevation and the range of habitat types. So yes, maybe you still have 90% of your habitat left, but if it's all transition to, say, regularly flooded marsh with no high tide habitat, that's not going to be usable for these sparrows anymore. We then have our Rachel Carson Reserve, which is our most depressing models here. So again, we only track Saltmarsh sparrows at this site, and we had the largest predicted loss of habitat for any of our sites. This is a pretty low-lying site already in general, with a lot of it being regularly flooded marsh. We can see this change to a lot more tidal flat in the interior, even more. And by 2050, most of this habitat that was there is now predicted to be tidal flat and unusable, with very little high tide habitat remaining of that transitional or irregularly flooded marsh. So that was a 66% loss by 2050, and then a 95% loss of this habitat by 2100. But even then, these little patches aren't going to be enough to sustain this population. So for changes in abundance based on habitat, so here we can see that our abundance changes, again, these are estimates, that we had a 17% decrease to 93% decrease in Saltmarsh sparrows, Saltmarsh sparrow abundance between 2050 and 2100 at our intermediate scenario. At Bird Island, this represented declines of 10% in 2050 to 87% of our abundance by 2100. At Mason Bar Island, this represented declines of 7% to 79% in Saltmarsh sparrows, down to only being able to support 1.5 birds by 2100. And then lastly, Rachel Carson, this represents declines of 65% already of abundance by 2050 to 95% loss of abundance by 2100, respectively. So this is less than one bird that habitat could potentially hold at Rachel Carson by 2100. So, our main conclusions are that birds may select by site based on presence of specific habitat types. Our capture rates were relatively stable throughout the winter stationary period, but we had some days with higher or lower numbers of capture. That was usually dictated by the tide level and also the researcher presence, or how many people we had out there helping us band. The more people, the more we could usually flush into our nets. So more research is needed on patch size requirement for the habitat occupancy for the winter of these sparrows, because like I stated, although we know that maybe we have 60% of that habitat still available in 2050, is it the right habitat type? Is that a big enough patch size? Maybe 3 birds can hang out on a few hectares, but we probably need a lot larger patch sizes to actually sustain this population. Populations on barrier islands may be at heightened risk because we don't have anywhere for these marshes to go through marsh migration when we're on these barrier islands, especially ones that are surrounded by the ICW. And then it's very likely that a small amount of habitat could remain in 2100, but it's too small to support any individuals of our study species. So without adapted management, sea level rise is going to lead to loss of essential habitat for an array of these marsh specialist species, including all of our sparrows. And even throughout, like I said, our banding period of 2019 through 2022, we started seeing fewer and fewer Saltmarsh sparrows. I don't know if they were wise to us or if there were just actually fewer of them around. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone. Thank you guys for having me today. I had a bunch of undergraduates and technicians help me on this project, and it wouldn't have been done without them. I had an awesome committee including Sarah on here, so thank you for your thoughtful comments throughout the whole process for me, and my advisor, Raymond Danner. He is no longer with the university, but he was a wonderful advisor. Everyone in the lab, and then all my funding sources. So Wildlife Research Commission, this research would not have been done without you, but it is all for you guys to take and use, and hopefully it can benefit the species into the future. So with that, I will take any questions. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great research. And so we can start into questions. I'll look at the chat, but also, let's see, Greg, if I can make you unmute, I'll do that. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself, Greg. If not, you may have to. If that's not going to work for you, Greg, you might have to type it in the chat, because I tried to allow you to speak. Okay, try chat. Okay.
And
okay.
Sorry if that was a little stilted. I haven't presented this in like a year and a half, and I've been like having babies and working. So if it was a little, apologies if I.
Okay, I'll check the chat. Let's see. But while people are typing in a question, one question I had about the Saltmarsh sparrows and these wintering sparrows I know you got their ranges and things like that. Do they act colonially, or do they defend a winter territory? And if they are they defending food resources, or how are they behaving?
We didn't really see like the one thing that I would like to do in the future is take our all the like all like the metrics we had. So like if we were able to, we couldn't sex them because it's winter, but we have some blood samples, so there is a potential that we can like take some of that data to see if they were kind of defending territories a little bit, or if like maybe the older individuals or the males maybe got more dominant, better habitat closer to that high tide habitat. We didn't have
Mhm.
time to look into that. They there was definitely overlap of the home ranges, but they were distinct. And so yeah, there's not a whole lot of habitat out there, especially at high tide. So you see a ton of overlap, but at the low tide habitat, they are seemingly holding fairly distinct little home ranges. It's
Mhm.
so hard to go out there at low tide and see them because they're so disparate and they're running along the marsh ground. So it's really hard to see if they're defending their territory or what they're really doing.
Mhm.
They do seem to be kind of maintaining their own little home ranges separate, but we don't know if it's territory or what's going on.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, so something maybe somebody can try to look into in the future.
Yeah. And like I said, we have some of the data there. We just haven't had time. We never had time to explore it. But if we could
Mhm.
take the blood and sex them, and then also look at just like their size and their sex and their
Mhm.
age, because we were able to age most of the birds,
Mhm.
we could see if that kind of changed, like if the younger birds had to go further out to get good foraging habitat.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, we just didn't have
Yeah.
time to explore that.
Mhm. I see. Greg typed in, the coast is constantly changing. Do you think there will be habitat more inland as water levels rise and create more islands, cuts, and existing shore? Because I kind of have that same question, whether other inland habitat might be created in marsh migration, I guess. I know these are on islands, but maybe some other
Yeah,
habitat would be created.
yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely potential. Like looking at sea level rise maps for the, say, the Cape Fear River, there is a potential for a lot of marsh habitat to be created. Um, but I guess your question is like, or the question is, can these birds find it in time? Or can that habitat be transitioned in time? So can that ghost forest turn into a good salt marsh that would then hold these sparrows in time for their populations not to decline to a level where they just can't exist anymore? That's an
Yeah.
unknown. I feel like that's more of a case for maybe the seaside sparrows. Maybe they can be a little more flexible with that. Um, I think Dr. Paul Taylor has done a little bit of work on that to see like once a ghost forest transitions to a marsh, how long it takes for I think these sparrows or maybe other birds to kind of then populate that. And I think it took longer than you would assume. And so I think it
Mhm.
took like 7 years for some of these,
Mhm.
or some
Mhm.
other research done as well,
Mhm.
for these areas to then actually be populated with birds after it was like pretty much ideal
Mhm.
habitat for them.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
So
so yeah, some of the other questions are similar about
yeah,
whether a habitat would be created farther inland and other locations, and whether the vegetation would be too different. That
I
might
feel like
be the
it's
case in some inland sites.
maybe some inland sites. Like I said, like
Mhm.
say up the Cape Fear River, it's getting a lot more saline. They're potentially dredging a ton, which is going to make the estuarine environment more saline up the river, potentially
Mhm.
creating more of this suitable marsh habitat for these sparrows.
Mhm.
Our bald head site was not sure exactly how many miles upriver,
Mhm.
um, but a few miles upriver, and it was one of our most productive sites. And so I
Mhm.
can see the
Mhm.
potential for that upriver some or these other estuarine environments. I mean the southeast coast of North Carolina is just hard for that. There's not a whole lot of location that isn't already developed that could
Mhm.
transition. So
Mhm.
maybe a little bit more inland, up estuaries, maybe there's some
Mhm.
room. We didn't study the northeast part of the state where there is a lot more open area for potentially transitioning these habitats. And so
Mhm.
that would be something
Mhm.
that I'd be interested to look into.
Yeah, so along that line, I was wondering if some of this, living shoreline management or other work by the What's it called? No, the term has lost me. Of the dredging, thin layer deposition, things like that. These active management tools, do you predict that some of those would be helpful in alleviating some of this loss?
Hopefully, yeah. I mean, we've been in talks with the Army Corps and stuff about how to potentially use beneficial dredge material to
Mhm.
maybe make a habitat that's like these remnant inlets somehow, or do thin layer replacement, or even thick layer replacement in some places. So I know that just kind of talking with the Army Corps folks, it sounds like they're even making more intertidal habitat using dredge material. So, I mean, I think there is a lot of potential if it's done soon enough and done properly. Um,
Mhm.
so, I mean, I think there's been some studies in like the breeding area using thin layer deposition. Um,
Mhm.
I was actually going to hop on a call with someone soon to kind of
Mhm.
ask how that's been going, see if it's been successful
Yeah.
for the Saltmarsh sparrows. Um, but yeah, I mean, even living shorelines, if you're kind of helping protect that area and have it not be just completely falling away at all points, could be useful. They do really like edge habitats, so creek edges and stuff are stuff that these sparrows really love. So protecting that as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm. Okay, and Greg had another question asking about if we have any idea where these sparrows might go during storm events, whether nor'easters or hurricanes, or if they've adapted to adjust to those storm events.
I have seen like pictures of them during migration, just like during a king tide event or other like storm events, just clinging to a piece of Spartina that they can find.
Mhm.
So like they'll be in congregations in these like small patches that are normally good for them, but just like clinging onto Spartina until they can have the tide goes out. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, they'll be in the shrub, they'll go up in the trees, up in these like maritime areas if it's close by, if it's that bad.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Yeah, I know you got some estimation of overwinter survival for the birds that y'all marked. Is that estimate being used in full annual cycle models? So you can estimate population change relative to survival at different stages in their life?
I don't think we've done that yet. And so it's like the problem is we collected all this data and then Ray left the university and I went off. It's like what happens with research, right? It's like we have the data, so it'd be nice to be put into these population models.
Hmm.
So if
Hmm.
anyone's willing to do that or wants to
Yeah.
do it, we have the data.
Okay. Another idea. It's maybe for people on the Atlantic Coast joint venture as well to work on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
they have all my data and stuff to use for
Uh-huh.
anything.
Uh-huh. Okay. I don't see any more questions popping up, and I want to thank everyone, and especially Maria, for joining us today. This is great. Thank you so
Yeah, thank
much.
you.
Um, I want to also remind everyone that this is going to be available on our YouTube channel, so you can find that on our web. And also next month, when we have the next version, we're going to have a presentation by Tanya Poole and Amy Braun. They're going to present about the Becoming an Outdoor Woman survey and assessment. So for more on that topic, join us next month. So thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Marie.
you all. I
All
can
right,
put
take
my
care.
email in the chat too if anyone is
Okay.
interested in emailing me.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And,
Thanks, Sarah.
thank you so much.
Have a
All
good
right.
one.
Bye-bye.